Good evening and welcome to the Steps Travel Instagram Live. For us at Steps, travel isn't simply about destination and places. It's about people, about meeting people, about making connections. Trust in strangers is the very essence of travel. And this evening I'm delighted to have with us a great traveller, an amazing traveller who relies upon that trust of strangers and is very often humbled by it. So let me try and get her on board now. Sophie. Hi. So I'm delighted to have with us tonight Sophy Roberts. Sophie is an amazing travel journalist, travel writer, and author. I'm a huge fan of you, Sophie. A, for your wonderful writing, your boundless energy, but primarily because, like me, you have a love for blank spaces on the map. So are there any blank spaces that you've returned from recently?
Oh, you see, I've had a bit of revision on that whole idea of blank spaces.
Oh,
Uh,
why is that?
it is such a loaded it's such a loaded phrase, isn't it? And so, you know, where do you start? Joseph Conrad, he came up with that phrase, or certainly popularized it. And there's this wonderful essay that he wrote about geography and some explorers, and he talks about this childhood map he had. 1852 it was dated, and in the middle of Africa it had a blank space, and his whole childhood longing was to get to that place that appeared empty. Of course it wasn't empty. It was convenient for Europeans to think it of as empty. It was a way to dehumanize a part of the world that was, of course, populated, more than populated, had 1,000 cultures. So I have been incredibly interested in, and we've got immediately into a really serious vein, but I have been so interested by my own romancing of that notion earlier on in my career, and now the reckoning with that romancing. There is no romance in a blank space. There is only our own ignorance. And that is why I travel, and is to correct my own ignorance first and foremost. And I guess my curiosity is the thing that drives me. And so the blank space is, to me, anything I haven't seen, experienced, or been able to kind of ground truth for myself. But the places that I've just got back from, that I've just been working in, that I was entirely ignorant about and ashamed, profoundly ashamed of my ignorance. Iraq. You know, we're just about to hit the 20th anniversary of the US-British invasion of that country. And I was ashamed of my ignorance, and thus my contribution to another country's pain on a level that was really pretty moving. Other, you know, there's so many things that you have to reckon with now, and that's where travel is changing. I'm hitting a really serious vein. It's 6:30 on a Thursday night. We should be having fun, but anyway.
Okay, so where else have you, other than Iraq, have you been to recently? I think before Christmas, were you in Iceland?
Yeah, that was really exciting, actually. I think one of the greatest travel books ever written is a send-up of the genre, which was by W.H. Auden. And off he went in 1936 with Louis MacNeice, the poet. And they had this incredible phrase for, it was between the wars. It was this moment of actually really open borders, if you're European. But there was a sense that things were about to was about to get bad, obviously. The rise of Hitler, etc., fascism across Europe, the Spanish Civil War. And so they traveled, and they used this phrase, before the souffle falls, which I just think is an incredible phrase to define a moment in time and catching that moment in time. And they talked about, travel is, it's full of opportunists, of which I'm guilty. It's full of escapism, of which I'm guilty. It's the self-awareness of those things that you have to kind of pack in your backpack now. And W.H. Auden and Louis MacNeice did that so beautifully in this trip they made to Iceland in 1936, because they kind of send up all the tropes of travel, of sort of conquering. You know, they weren't conquering at all. They were really, really funny and really bad travelers, and constantly were kind of getting lost or getting stuck in the mud, or they were amused and delighted by serendipity, which is one of the, you know, great joys of travel. So yeah, I was in Iceland in the Western Fjords.
You just mentioned Auden, and you mentioned earlier Conrad, and behind you there's a small section of your amazing library. It's almost as big as my library, but not quite as big. But when you're going somewhere, to what extent do you read beforehand, or do you read in situ, or do you want to go there with an uncluttered mind and sort of find out for yourself? But how do you balance that?
Okay, so there's two approaches. There's one approach which Sylvain Tesson, I don't know anybody that's listening to this, Sylvain Tesson, I think, is one of the great contemporary travel writers, and he wrote a book, Constellations of the Forest, A Year in the Taiga. It's a Siberian book where he stayed in a cabin on the shores of Lake Baikal, and in it, and it's the most brilliant phrase, he says, on Baikal, read Byron. In Venice, read Lermontov. I've just paraphrased, but essentially read the opposite, because it stimulates the mind to think originally. And you know, when you put, when I'm teaching writing, I talk to students about putting the two wrongs make a right. Put the wrongs things together. My first book, The Lost Pianos of Siberia. Pianos, Siberia, they just are so wrong together, but they make a right, because a good metaphor makes you think of something in fresh light, if you like. It's sort of stimulating. And so sometimes when I'm traveling, I read books which are completely the opposite of the place, in order to kind of get my own brain thinking in an original or a more original way. Right here, sitting behind me are books I took to Iraq. I traveled, as I said, with deep ignorance. I had to read and read and read every minute of the day when I was there. There was a brilliant book, Justin Marozzi. Oh, so good.
Are you reading history, or are you reading contemporary accounts, or just a mixture of both?
I read a mix. I always try and get the best, a good strong history. So so Marozzi on Iraq was really good for me. But I also read a lot of poetry. Poetry stimulates images, and contemporary poetry doesn't have enough of an audience. I buy it. I think it is money very, very well spent. You know, I've got this. And also when there's more and more poetry is going into translation, and again, poetry does something. It's intense imagery that does something to my own writing. It makes me think how much harder those words need to work. And you know, I often am writing for the FT. A good full page in the FT is a complete luxury in my industry. I love this newspaper. If my editor's watching, he's one of the greats, because he allows, you know, we get 2,000 words or 1,800 words to write, but you've got to really make those words count. And therefore, poetry in that process matters to me, because it allows you to really distill an image and a feeling. And yeah, so a mixture of poetry, a mixture of non-fiction, a mixture of fiction. Yeah, I read a lot.
So in your writing, you're trying to sort of, you're painting images with your words. Is that and that's how you storytell?
Yes and no. I mean, you know, travel writing can suffer from just a loading of imagery. I remember I was reading something not so long ago, and it was like I didn't like the piece of writing because it kind of glittered like a cheap jewel. You know, it had like everything. It was always a color or a glitter and that's the thing with travel writing, like bad travel writing, like bad travel photography. It's a sunset, it's a cliche, it's a pink, rather than a kind of, you know, the wrong light shows it differently. Do you know what I mean? It's again, it's sort of trying to see things from a slightly side angle. So so poetry matters for imagery, but in terms of story, that's something else. Story is narrative. Narrative is an arc. It should have a momentum and a pace, and there are, I mean, so you've got to be able to find that. A journey has a natural arc because you begin at A and you finish at Z, but you can also give a journey a different arc because it can be the spirit of inquiry. around an idea. It can be a historical thread, which tends to be the thing that I lean into. For writers who are far better than me, it's more memoir. They want to give more
Very,
of
very few,
themselves.
if any at all, but yeah.
No, but memoir is something I don't particularly like the myself in the story, because I don't have enough to say about myself, you know. So or certainly anything that's interesting. So I tend to kind of keep that out of my books. Which, you know, you get people that read travel writing in order to know everything about the author, but if my readers knew about me, they wouldn't want to know, they wouldn't want to know anymore. I read a lot, that's it.
You're a very sort of, you like the human stories, a lot of human stories. So how do you find those, or is that just sort of serendipitous moments that sort of, as you meet people, you sit with them, you give them time, you empathize with them? How do you find those stories?
It's ground truthing, feet on the ground. I'm totally drawn to strangers. I adore strangers. I take that risk. It may burn me at one point in the future. It hasn't done significantly to date. I believe that people are more good than bad, and I also believe people want contact more than they want distance. And when you strike up a conversation, it is kind of almost always fulfilling, and you never know. Everyone has a story. That is the honest truth. It's everyone has a story. Some of them have seemed more melodramatic than another, but they're no less human. They're no less profound in their way. So yeah, I love strangers.
You mentioned your wonderful book, Los Pianos of Siberia, which, if you haven't read it, I advise everybody listening to this to definitely read it. It's one of the great travel books. But what drew you to that story? How did that come about? The whole, was it, well, how did it come about?
How did it start? It's
and
funny,
also,
actually.
and also, sorry, there are some quite poignant stories there, some human stories that that you write about. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I was just walking with my youngest son before we went on this call, actually, and he said, he was talking about this new one I'm doing. He goes, do you ever think you're eccentric, Mum? I was like, no. Do you think I'm eccentric? I'm not eccentric. I think everybody else, like, how can they call me eccentric? My book, you know, it's so normal to go looking for a piano in Siberia. And he goes, well, some of my friends at school think it's a bit eccentric, Mum. And I was like, no. Because what I find so exciting is when you get given an opportunity like I did. I heard a pianist play in the middle of nowhere in the Siberian steppe on a bad piano, some of the most beautiful music I've ever heard. It was Bach. And you can't imagine, you know, it's floating up through this hole in the roof of this tent, like you know, stars above, nobody else around except for the herders. And something happened, something magical happened when a friend of mine I'm with that knows a lot more about music than me, a German, says, what a pity. You know, that piano is not good enough for her talent. She's a Mongolian concert pianist. She needs an instrument worthy of her gift. And he knows me well, and he said, you must go and find her one of the lost pianos of Siberia. And in that phrase, to go back to an earlier part of the conversation, there were two things that didn't belong together: pianos, Siberia. And that was enough to take a risk. A good story is a risk. It shouldn't be comfortable. I'm not into the business of writing travel that is, oh my goodness, I was really scared, or oh my goodness, I was really uncomfortable. I think we all know we're through those times. I've got, you know, really, really warm jackets. I've got a mobile phone, a satellite phone if I need one. I can always get out. So we're over those times of sort of false jeopardy. There is no false jeopardy. The only jeopardy is not taking the risk in the first place on a story that may or may not deliver the result. And, you know, for Siberia, I took very early on, John Steinbeck went, again, these incredible years, the 1930s, incredible years for travel. John Steinbeck, off he went. Robert Capa, and he talked about, God, it was such a good phrase that, you know, we made our plans in this way, and if we could do it, it would be a good story, and if we couldn't do it, it would still be a good story about not being able to do it. So, you know, inviting failure into the travel narrative is, to me, really important. Not false jeopardy. Not, oh, I might die, or oh my goodness, I'm so uncomfortable. But the failure of being able to follow through on a quest.
And so you talk about false jeopardy. What about challenging environments? Was Siberia one of the more challenging environments, not just geographically and weather-wise, but from a political sense?
Yeah, really hard politically. Really hard politically, as we're seeing playing out. It's a really, really frightening country, politically, deeply frightening. Humanly, no, incredible. On the human level, the day-to-day level of common people, those doors opened and the hearts opened and the stories opened, and that's what I defend in my book, is common humanity. It's no different from where I live to where you are to the back, you know, the sort of remotest bits of Siberia. The difference is the politicians. The difference is the horrifying fear and lies that can be created through the control of the information that we are given, and that was really frightening. So the jeopardy working in Russia, and it's a jeopardy that is real in many countries of the world, is, you know, how do you work as a journalist in places where journalism is dangerous? And even though I'm not a political writer, I'm entering that space. So yeah, it was frightening. You know, the Russians took me in. I had 8 hours of questioning. And it's not something I chose to put in my book, actually, quite deliberately, because I did not want to take away from all the good in the room. My story wasn't about me surviving Siberia. It was about millions and millions of people that didn't, because they got strung into a gulag, or they got sent off in a Tsarist exile system, or whatever it was. It's not about the travel writer surviving the difficulty at all.
I think you're very, very right about the human side. And for me, sort of travel is about breaking down the prejudice, the preconceptions we have of different places. And it's finding out that we are essentially the same. We laugh about the same things. We want the same things. And it's that human side of it. Mm-hmm. You talked about travel journalism there. Is there a distinction between a travel writer and travel journalism, or is that we don't want to go down that rabbit hole?
No, I think it's interesting. I mean, I read a book the other day, and it's always a hot topic. You know, travel writers are allowed to make it up. Travel journalists aren't, I tell you. I mean, not when you're working for the publications I work for. You back up, you fact check. So I approach my travel, my books in a really similar way. I'm really, really rigorous fact checker. The only thing that is, and I never make up an encounter, and I use real names, don't change names. If they don't want the name in, I will say it, but I never change a name. And I will say it if for security reasons I'm not putting the name in, or privacy reasons, but I don't change names. No. And I don't make up encounters. Interestingly, Bruce Chatwin, I think of him as a travel writer. He's on those shelves. I was interviewing for this podcast I'm doing with you guys, Gone to Timbuktu. I was interviewing Colin Thubron, and he pointed out to me, he said, Bruce Chapman never described himself as a travel writer. And when he won a prize for travel writing, he handed it back, because he said, I don't write travel books, I write fiction. Isn't that interesting? I write fiction. And so he was very clear about the space he was in. They were journeys. They were kind of, you know, the whole idea of Gone to Timbuktu, which is his phrase, there's 2 Timbuktus. There's Timbuktu, the place, which, my goodness, he evokes that in the equivalent of in Patagonia or the Australian outback. But there's also a Timbuktu of the mind, and that's the imagined place. And he fuses those so beautifully, and in a completely different space. He owned that space in a way that I don't think has been matched since. I am maybe chained to my journalism training, and I would like to be able to cast them off a bit, but I just can't quite make it up. I can change a narrative arc I change chronology sometimes because that's how you need to structure a book, otherwise it's incredibly unwieldy. So the narrative order of things I changed in Lost Pianos, but I didn't change any event, any name.
And you mentioned books. I know that you're working on a book at the moment. Are you able to talk a little bit about that, or is that sort of is it all in the wraps at the moment, or some of the travels that you've done? Yeah. I know you were in Tanzania at one stage last year at some point, but
Well, it's a book. It's. I have to deliver in September. It'll be published next year by the same publishers, Transworld here in the UK, with Penguin, and it is. It's a book that uses, like Los Pianos did, a single footnote in history to tell a bigger story, to take me into place, to take me into a reckoning. That reckoning is the 19th century, which, you know, takes us back to Conrad. It's a book that I really wanted to do in spite of the difficulties. You know, I wanted to understand the, you know, there's a phrase, travel writers are the traveling colonials of our time. You know, what are the optics now as an outsider going in? You know, we're living in a world where, you know, the gaze needs to have a lot more rigor around what is that gaze, what authority does that voice have or not have. And so I really wanted to wrestle with those difficulties, for good or bad, in order to make me a more self-aware writer and traveler. And it may blow up in my face, but it has been to me, the difficulty of the job of what I do and I'm passionate about is the reckoning with the encounter, and not the ease of the encounter, if that makes sense. It's you know, that's that Mark Twain for a phrase, isn't it? History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And when you see those rhymes now, and with times past, I think you have to absorb the rhyme and interpret it for yourself. So that's why.
Well, you can't say much about it. We very much look forward to reading it. When next year does it come out, you think? Or next year?
It's a bit of Africa. It's a bit of the Middle East. It's a lot of things.
Let's talk destination, if we may, for a while, rather than sort of writing per se. What has been a sort of one of your more surprising destinations that you've travelled to?
God, they're all so surprising. I mean, the thing, you know, places that have sort of taken my breath away. Chad, we travelled there together back in the day. Yeah.
That was done in Zakuma in the southeast, a park run by African Parks. But then you also went up to Anyeli up in the north of Chad, this amazing desert scenery. So.
Yeah, that was incredible. And that came, you know, that was Stranger. That was the Stranger thing. You know very well that story of the guy at the bar who Rocco Rava, who became the contact I made that took me up into the Enedi Desert. I mean, what an incredible story. This man, Rocco Rava, is Italian. He was born to two doctors who were in the 1970s, same year as me, born in 1973, and he was a young baby, and mum and dad, having been Italian doctors in Nairobi, decided to drive overland back to Milan rather than fly, just to have a last adventure before they went back into the rat race of medicine in Italy. But they got kind of delayed on the way, and they never left the desert. And Rocco was brought up in the Sahara. You know, he described kind of hanging from a camel's neck in one of these kind of Tuareg scarves. And that was his childhood and his adolescence, and now his adulthood. And he knows that desert. I mean, it's changed because of the geopolitical patterns that are so disturbed in that part of the world, but Mali, Niger, northern Chad. So, you know, he was the guy at the bar that opened up my world to the Sahara, and blows you away.
There you are, straight again. You've gone straight back to the human story, and that's what I love about you and your writing, is that you find this human angle all the time, and go back to it. Speaking of going back, is there a place where you would go back to, or you've got this wanderlust for, and curiosity was the word you used earlier on, for finding new places, or is there somewhere that sort of keeps on drawing you back?
No, I mean, you know, so many different places for so many different reasons. A place that is dear to me because it's a very personal place, and I associate it with people I love, is Nepal. In eastern Nepal, in the Khumbu. You know, my husband worked there for a while. My children's, effectively their godparents, are there. There's a house called, I mean, perfectly, the Happy House, where we go a lot, and it's really, really special because it belongs to our family history. So that is meaningful for me for those reasons. But God, I mean, you can pretty much just like drop a pin in a map and I want to go. I was reading John Steinbeck, Travels with Charlie. I do this really fun book club, and there's one line, and he talks about he's traveling.
Can I stop you there? You do this book club. It must be quite
I do a
intimidating
book
for
club,
the rest
yeah.
of the people to do the book club with you, because you sort of quote things the whole time. And
I love my book club. It's one of my highlights of the month. There's about 8 of us, and we all have completely opposite opinions. But Travels with Charlie by John Steinbeck, and he's doing this road trip. And in the middle of this book, he talks about Fargo in North Dakota being this place that sits in the middle of America, and it sits in a book's binding. And it's like always stuck in a book's binding, Fargo, because it's just where it falls. And that to me was just like the best image of me trying to pick away at that tiny bit of the map. It's like Fargo suddenly became interesting to me. So, you know, yeah, I'm pretty open to pretty much anything aside from maybe the Côte d'Azur in July. It's not my scene.
so how do you find new places? Is that sort of is it just word of mouth? Is it people like myself or Will Bolsover, who I saw his name popping up earlier on? How do you find where are you going next then, for instance?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, obviously, I rely hugely on a network of intelligence, which exists in a network of people like you, Will Bolsover, friends of mine in America at GeoX, they're fantastic. They have deep knowledge on the ground. And, you know, that group of people that we know are generous because they know that in bringing travelers to those places commercially, which is your side of the business, you need footfall to justify those projects in remote parts. So it really matters, the sort of support network, if you like, and let's call it responsible tourism. It matters. So that intelligence coming into the room is very, very important to me. I get tip-offs, I get stories and all the rest of it. But otherwise, I follow a hunch. I follow a hunch and it usually delivers, to be honest, because there's an abundance of story. When I was training to be a journalist, I trained in New York at the Columbia School of Journalism, and the best thing I learned all year was this thing that my husband used to call my serial killer wall. And it was a habit that you take, is ripping out from newspapers and magazines anything at all, and you just rip out, because there'd be something in there. There'd be some motivating impulse, which is what you're looking for a story. It's a motivating impulse, and my wall would just be covered, layered, yellowing in the sun. It would go deeper and deeper and deeper, and then something would constantly nag at you that there was something in it. And that's how I find a story. There's a nag, there's a kind of an ache, and it's a curiosity, and it's like, I've got to kind of do that. And that was what the Lost Pianos, that I didn't act on that immediately. It was an ache and a nag, and then you know, this dear mutual friend of ours who was working in Russia with a tiger conservationist, Will Bolsover, that nag became a possibility. I could check it out. That became a story. This book I'm doing at the moment, its genesis is in 2015 in the Congo. It's been sitting on my serial killer wall like an ache. And during the beginning of lockdown, I thought, I can't ignore it anymore. But when you can't ignore it, in book writing, for me, I'm a slow writer. When you can't ignore it and you decide to pick it up and work with it, you're committing 4 to 5 years of your life. And so you've got to be pretty sure that that's motivating impulse coming out of the wall is the one that is really kind of matters, because it's not going to be easy.
It's not going to be easy, but as you said earlier on, it's about taking that risk, and you've got to take that risk. So you travel a lot, and I'm not one. Whilst I think Greta Thunberg is great in many things that she says that we should stay on land, but I think that but it's not a sort of binary decision to fly or not to fly. But I think that we used the word responsibility earlier on. We should be more responsible in our travels, and that we should travel less but travel better. But what do you do about your carbon footprint, and how do you sort of mitigate that in any way?
Well, in any way is a very good addition to that. comment, because it's, you know, guilty. I changed my behavior significantly in lockdown, and I made a decision that I was going to go much longer, much less often. And I have followed through on that. You know, when I did my Siberia book, I went 5 or 6 times to Russia for 3 or 4 weeks at a time, and I did it in blocks because I've got kids. I've got, you know, two boys, who were young boys at the time, and that seemed like an appropriate thing to do. When I was doing this new book, I sat down with the family and I said, look, I've got a really big journey I need to do in Africa. And it was still a red zone, and it was still in that kind of COVID-y difficulty. And they just all said, Mum, just go do it in one. Go do it in one. You keep banging on about climate change.
Did Jack say, Mum, you're eccentric, just go, yeah?
He said, you don't cook for me anyway, Dad does. But which is true story. But the truth of it is the way that I've pivoted, and it's a genuine pivot, is if I'm going to go somewhere, I go longer. I try to get more from it, and I go a bit slower. Before I was almost like one night, kind of, it was always changing too fast. And I think that sort of thoughtless consumption that's a bit of a shift in me, but it's still consumption. It's still roaring consumption. So that's my decision. And also the places I write about. I try to write about places that aren't greedy. I don't like greedy hotel life. I don't like I can't stand I think we've gone so beyond those times of sort of just abundance. I find it really unattractive, actually, of kind of just waste and abundance. And I think that I mean, you know, you're getting me at my most straight talking I think if the hotel industry doesn't shift quite soon, they're going to not be picking up the generation that's coming through, because that abundance is not a good look.
And so you talk about generations changing, and has writing changed lots in terms of the format that you do? You mentioned the FT, you do a lot forwards, more long form. Has that changed much over the years?
Yeah, it's changed a lot. I think it's to do with clickbait, the roundup, the lack of expertise, but quick output is being driven by brands having to satisfy the daily kind of, you know, gimme.
This daily one, gimme, and what you just said, and I totally agree with about how we should travel. How do you sort of square that circle? How do you get that across to editors, or is it you just writing for Tom at the FT, or how do we create change in other areas?
Well, it's each market to their own. You know, that works. That sells advertising for a different kind of publication. That's fine. You know, we each do our own thing in our own space. For me, I like words. For me, I like the space to think it out. So to me, an 1,800 word piece with a certain audience is appropriate for me, but that's not to diminish another kind of writer who's incredibly funny, who can do a sort of really witty, pithy 50-word write-up. We're all different. I just happen to fall into that space. I had another brilliant writer, one of my favorites, and oh my goodness, you should read he's done one travel piece about Alaska. Whoa. John Lee Anderson, New Yorker author, first class. John Lee said to me once, I commissioned him years ago when I was working on an American magazine, and he said to me, and it was a 3,000 word commission. He goes, I'm not sure, feel a bit uncomfortable with 3,000 words. I was like, it's a really big story. He was like, he was used to working at 10,000 words, which is the New Yorker's sort of space. So you fall into your own limitations or opportunity. I'm comfortable in that 2,000 word space. That's what I like, or books. Other people, like I say, they can do the quick stuff. I can't. I'm not very good at it. I've done it, but it's not my thing.
Well, I'm glad it's not your thing, because I love your 2,000 words. I love your Lost Siberia, and I love hearing you talk. I think you're so wonderfully articulate, so prescient, so bright on everything. And I'd love to talk to you for a lot longer, but we've only probably got a few more minutes. So I don't know, where next? You'd like to say where you're going to next, or?
I've got a job in Canada coming up, which will be interesting. I've got, oh, I do a lot of my work I do with of somebody who I just adore, both artistically and on a private level, Michael Turek, a photographer. And
I
we've
thought you were
been,
going to say me for a moment there, because Michael always comes up. Why is it always Michael?
Michael, you know, Michael's just great. We all love Michael. Anyway, Michael and I have been working on a long project, and that's a sort of real slow burn. He's a very patient man, and you know, he shoots on film, and that creates a sort of a different encounter with place, and it slows down the thinking as well in a way. So because you have to wait for it to go off to the lab, and then you have to wait to it to come back. You can't be impatient with it. And that putting that sort of space and time back into the room, I really benefit from, because it's not my natural instinct. You can hear I'm like, you know, I'm always kind of like speedy Sophie. And he balances me out. And we've got a long-term project we're working on, which I feel passionate about. And I feel that I feel blessed that if there's one thing that's come out of this career in magazines, it's been the opportunity to work and collaborate with photographers. Because, and this is a good one actually. I can give our podcast a little bit of a push. Gone to Timbuktu. Yesterday I was interviewing Don McCullen, who's one of the all-time greats. You know, conflict photographer who's worked with, I mean, you couldn't make it up, Norman Lewis, Bruce Chatwin, you know, Barnaby Rogers, the whole kind of history of great travel writers in the last 67. He's now 87 years old, Don. And he talked about,
he was in Ghana recently, wasn't he, I think?
Yeah. But he was talking about how it's now really hard if he has a young photographers knocking on his door, which he does, who want to travel and take pictures either in conflict or in more benign environments. There isn't the same opportunity for publication. There isn't the same opportunity to see those images in print. There isn't the same opportunity for kind of space and thought around these pictures, and that to me is a terrible tragedy. It's something that is changing, and I mean, there was one, he showed me this magazine. I don't know if any of the people listening today have seen it. It's called Cornucopia, and it's published out of Istanbul, and he's got a 20-page story in there, this issue, and it is just ravishing. It is ravishing, because you need 20 places to go into the Roman ruins of the ancient ruins of Turkey, when it's Don McCullen's eye that you're being given. You need 20 pages to read what Barnaby has to say. And so that sort of, you know, that I'm a massive advocate for fighting for the art of great photography in this space, and I am extremely grateful to all the talent that I've ever got to work with, and we need more of it. We've got to shout for it. You guys have, you know, we've got to support it, we've got to bankroll it, because it's an art form.
But yeah, so you mentioned young people coming and asking Don for advice and stuff like that. You must get a lot of young writers coming up to you and asking you for advice. Sort of, I don't know. What do you say to them? What did you say? Just be curious, just stick at it, take risks.
Yeah, I mean, I try to be helpful. I think I'm an optimist, so I think you've got to keep on going. I had very good advice from someone early on in my career, which is just got to drop yourself into the space and own it. You know, you've got to take the risk. And if you stick at it, it's a profession, and that shouldn't be underestimated. You have to learn the rules. You have to learn rules in order to break them. You have to write a good and rigorous sentence, and that comes through accepting an editor. You know, if you can't accept the edit experience, then you'll never improve as a writer. Your words are, who is it? You know, you've got to kill off your little darlings. Who was it that said that? I think it was Hemingway, I forget. But you have to kill off your little darlings. You can't be precious about what you've just written. You have to put it down, breathe, show it to an editor you respect, and work with it. So that's really critically important to the process. I try to encourage that candor in kind of writers that want to get into the game, and say, if you can't enter that space and know it's safe, then you shouldn't start, because no author, writer is coming in with a polished sentence. A first draft is a first draft, and it's usually unrecognizable on a second.
And final question: what are you reading at the moment? Probably about sort of, knowing you, 5 books at once that you're speed reading through. But what's top of your, or by your bedside table at the moment?
Well, this book, you're going to hear a lot about it. It's called The Rooster House by Victoria Bellim. It's coming out next month. It's about Ukraine. It's absolutely staggering. The other one that I just got sent this morning that just distracted me, look, I know where they all are, Leo McCarran, a story called Wounded Tigris.
About the Tigris Euphrates. I was sent something about it yesterday. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Leon's he's a real deal. He spent a lot of time there, and he's written a book following the river and in Iraq, and I think that is a really exciting book. Lots. But those two are two.
Sophie, you are the real deal. I've loved our 40-minute conversation. It's been an absolute joy, and I just every time I speak to you, I learn more, and my vocabulary improves, and it's so wonderful. So we're always here to support you, back you, carry on doing the wonderful writing you are, and we look forward to your book coming out next year.
Well, thanks for supporting the Gone to Timbuktu podcast, because that is a genuine attempt to support other writers and photographers in a space where we need voices, and we need people to be heard. So that is a very, very genuine attempt to find another space for recognition. So we have well-known writers, we have less-known writers, we have new writers coming through, we have photographers, filmmakers who might be doing something pretty art house, plus the big ones like, Don McCunnen's coming up shortly. But thanks for supporting it, because it means a lot.
It's a pleasure, and I think well done you for giving them that voice, that platform, and having those conversations. So thank you for all you do, Sophie. It's been an absolute pleasure.
I'd love seeing you. Take care, Justin.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.